Thank you very much. What I'm about to read to you today is the first chapter in my book on the conservation of race debate called The End of Race. It's a look at the history of the conservation of race debate in the philosophy of race, especially as it's occurred in analytic philosophy. The debate in analytic philosophy of race has swirled around category analysis of Du Bois's ideas and exegesis of some of his key early works. Now, of course, the figures of this debate are very well known by now. People like Anthony Appiah, Howard McGarry, Bernard Boxall, Lucius Outlaw, and Naomi Zak. I return, though, not to Du Bois, but to Frederick Douglass. And why? Because I feel that Frederick Douglass's notions of assimilation and amalgamation, right, are very key to understanding the terms of this conservation of race debate, especially since, despite the fact that we tend to reject Douglass's notions of assimilation and amalgamation, those ideas still taint, if you will, the visions of integration that motivate a lot of the participants in that debate. I return to Douglass because of his vision of universal human brotherhood, which is, of course, very much a part of those participants as well. Now, Douglass's reception in analytic philosophy, in African American philosophy, has been largely focused, initially at least, on how to use Douglass's fight with Covey scene to elucidate the idea of self-respect as derived from folks like, well, Rousseau, Kant, and Rawls. Later, the scholarship on Douglass turns to a critique of his acceptance of natural law theory, his interpretations of the Constitution, and the shortcomings of his assimilation and amalgamation theories. Now, I'm going to argue today that they have not expunged Frederick Douglass completely from their thoughts. And Frederick Douglass remains a very important figure when we think about the conservation of race debate. And not just for those of us who pay attention to the debate within analytic philosophy, but for many other theorists as well. Now, that's sort of one aspect of the book. Another aspect of the book is to start to interrogate conceptions of the future of race. There's a lot of publications these days on the future of race. And I find that these conceptions of the future of race have within them embedded conceptions of the future and race. Conceptions of what the future should look like with race. What should we do? And it's very fascinating. I think those two things are very distinct. And today I won't get into that, but please keep in mind that one of the things that I'm trying to do is interrupt, at least, these easy assumptions and easy ideals that we have about the end of race in the future. Now, Frederick Douglass argued that the newly emancipated black Americans should assimilate into Anglo-American society and culture. Social assimilation would then lead to the entire physical amalgamation of the two groups and the emergence of a new intermediate group that would be fully American. He, like those who were to follow, was driven by a vision of universal human fraternity, in the light of which the varieties of human difference were incidental and far less important than the ethical, religious, and political idea of personhood. Douglass's version of this vision was formed by natural law theories and a Protestant Christian conception of universal human fraternity, as it was for much of the abolition movement in the U.S. and Britain. His vision and his fierce commitment to abolitionism, moreover, were characterized by his own experience of slavery. His political and ethical vision, his moral universe, generated his conception of America, his interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, and his solution to the nation's race problem. Unpacking Douglass's vision will help us to understand those positions that follow his legacy. Just as those who argue that race ought to be conserved turn to the figure of W.E.B. Du Bois, those who disagree with the conservation of race need to consider Douglass's arguments and their relationship to Douglass's assimilation-amalgamation solution. Moreover, those who work under the long shadow of Douglass would do well to carefully consider the historical reasons why Du Bois and Booker T. Washington's strategies for racial justice eclipsed Douglass's. Now, in this chapter, I review Douglass's religious and political ideals, his application of them to the issues of race, black American identity, and constitutional interpretation, and how his ideals and positions developed into his projection about the future of race in the United States. All of these matters are guiding features of the anti-race and racial anomalous positions in the contemporary conservation of race debate. These anti-race and anomalous positions are very apparent in analytic philosophy of race. But this vision is also part of race theories that have become very popular, I think, of course, in a broader world. Race theories that argue for the denationalization of identity, the diasporic identity, and various theories of mestizaje. Now, additionally, I ask that we consider the cognitive and emotional conflicts that arise within us as we reflect upon Douglas's vision and this nation's contradictions and failures in its long racial history. Douglas, of course, frequently referenced this conflict. It was at the center of his experience of being American. In his first narrative, Douglas characterized this conflict as his soul's complaint. As a slave, he yearned for freedom and came to understand the liberal political and religious ideals that surrounded him. God's justice, or the ideal of American justice, were not imminent. This gave him much pain and caused in him a good measure of moral disorientation. Yet he resolved to make up for this absence of divine and natural justice through his own and other subaltern resources. And as a free man and an abolitionist, he yearned for a greater reconciliation of the nation between black and white and between the nation and its ideals. In both instances, the obstacles to his desires, the enormity of the task, and the elusiveness of justice often left him somewhere between madness and reconciliation to his misery. His turmoil, a reaction of moral indignation and disorientation, a reaction to bondage in the putative land of liberty, is ours as well. Douglas, like many white and black intellectuals of his time, was an Enlightenment thinker, a 19th century modernist. He believed in progress and the advance and mission of Western civilization. Douglas's modernism, additionally, was marked by a steadfast and individualistic faith in the inevitability of Western Christendom's advance toward justice and human brotherhood. Douglas then had a faith, albeit a troubled and evolving one, in God's providence that would force the world to realize God's justice. Humans, as evidenced by slavery, resist God's justice and providence. Thus, the downfall of slavery must be worked toward. This idea of Douglas's puts an emphasis on practice and the centrality of the progressive human forces. Douglas put the agency of God's providence squarely into the hands of humans. He did so because he had much to be cynical about popular and pro-slavery conceptions of providence, although he never surrenders the concept. He undermines a strong notion of providence, yet he does not negate it altogether. Rather, he asserts that its trajectory is an all-pervading light, which for him would be truth, liberty, and equality. The brilliance of this light, though, depends on the actions of individuals, just as he depended upon himself instead of miracles for his deliverance. Douglas's faith, and in particular his faith that African America would rise up, was intensely active. Faith, however, without human action is empty, hypocritical, and even a scourge for him. It is clear from his autobiographies that he came to these conclusions after experiencing the evil of American Christian slaveholders. In his writings, he repeatedly claimed that the worst slaveholders were those who professed faith because they coded their psychological, physical, and sexual violence with Christian nostrums, and feeling justified, they then increased their crimes. It was due to the lack of ethical action on the part of American Christians that he denounces the practice of the American church at every opportunity. Now, Douglas's troubled and evolving faith, with its individualism, anti-supernaturalism, and demand for human action, leads directly to his conception of universal human brotherhood. These two religious and political conceptions generated his concepts of race and American identity, and his evolving reading of the U.S. Constitution. His faith and his struggle unto apostasy runs through these conceptions, and they seem foundationless without remembering the components of his moral universe. Furthermore, and obviously, Douglas's struggle with his faith is behind the articulation of his rage, utter disappointment, and alienation. Douglas desperately desired that God's judgment would be visited on the heads of those who blatantly and cruelly broke God's law. And when thunderbolts did not descend, despite his faith, he was pushed to deism, and at some dramatic moments, apostasy by the obstinate evil of his world. Now, due to time restrictions, I'm not going to read the sections where I give an exegesis of his and a history of his conception of race and his constitutional interpretation, or his idea of American identity and its relationship to black American identity. I do, however, want to say a few things, though, about his conception of assimilation and amalgamation. Douglass, obviously, from his amalgamationist position, accepted the existence of biologically distinct races. He accepted a climatist monogenism, which asserted the unity of the human species, and that human diversity was due to the climates of the lands in which the races were isolated for centuries. His acceptance of races needs to be qualified, however, because he did not put a great weight on what he characterized as merely technical distinctions in the brotherhood of humanity. Although he did not deny these technical distinctions, he believed that the existence of these distinctions ebbed and flowed and were overshadowed by human fraternity. Douglass supported the amalgamation of the biological races and assimilation of black and white Americans into what he imagined as a new sort of American. It is important to note the distinction between assimilation and amalgamation to understand Douglass's project. Assimilation and amalgamation are separate doctrines. Amalgamation does not follow by itself from assimilation or vice versa. Early black nationalists such as Edward Blyden, Martin Delany, and Alexander Crummell were separatists, but they also thought that blacks needed to assimilate by accepting Christianity and Western civilization. Booker T. Washington, while not a black nationalist, also accepted an assimilationist separatist strategy. Douglass's position, since he held that black and whites would not only assimilate to each other, but also amalgamate into an intermediate race, supported a program of assimilationism and amalgamationism. Now, Douglass began to advocate the controversial position of amalgamation during the 1860s. More than a strategy, he thought it was a process that would naturally occur in the U.S. over time, eventually creating an intermediate race. He believed that amalgamation, combined with assimilation, would be the only solid and final solution of race, prejudice, and division in this nation. Douglass's stance on assimilation and amalgamation speaks volumes about his stance on the conservation of race. He equated the preservation of racial distinctiveness with the preservation of racial prejudice. The positions he took on many topics were informed by his stance against racial separatism and the conservation of the races in the United States. Douglass complained about attempts to build separate Negro pews, Negro berths and steamboats, Negro cars, Sabbath or weekday schools, churches, and so on. He argued that attempts to separate blacks were in the interest of pro-slavery and would hinder black uplift. It is for these reasons that he stood against the separatist, emigrationist visions of the American Colonization Society, founded by whites, and the African Civilization Society, founded by blacks. Although Douglass disfavored racial organizations, he thought it was necessary for African Americans to organize and unify to fight against slavery and racial prejudice and struggle for justice. Nonetheless, for Douglass, this political organizing and unification was not to be for reasons of race or culture, but strictly for political reasons. While he expected blacks to unify to fight for the end of slavery and for justice, he railed against separatist accommodations, institutions, and organizations, and urged blacks to act without distinctions of color. Douglass's final solution was the complete assimilation, disbursement, and amalgamation of blacks into the white population. To this end, Douglass vigorously rejected notions of race pride, racial union, and black nationalism. Race, according to Douglass, could not be used to fight racism. Likewise, self-segregation could not be used to fight segregation. Although some of the particulars of Douglass's arguments have been rejected, his idealistic vision of human brotherhood, his skepticism about the political and moral value of race pride and self-segregation, his rejection of race as a political or social category, and his hope that assimilation and racial amalgamation will bring an end to racial oppression and result in a stronger America, more consistent with his founding liberal principles, remain influential in contemporary U.S. racial politics. And I would add to that, contemporary American philosophy. Everyone from Naomi Zack through, in cultural studies, Paul Gilroy. Now, along with Douglass's adulation of the political and religious ideals present in his comments about God's providence and justice, human brotherhood, racial interdependency of the American identity, and natural law behind the Constitution, there was his constant demand for right practice. Although he experienced good and just practice toward him and black Americans in his own life after escaping slavery and in the abolition movement, Those moments were fleeting. Wrong and oppressive practice was what he largely witnessed in his personal relations with whites and in national and international political arenas. There is a consciousness of political and religious utter failure in his writings, from his first autobiography published in 1845 through his 1894 pamphlet, The Lesson of the Hour, which answers the question, why is the Negro lynched? Throughout his life as a journalist and activist, the contradiction between ideal and practice fed his rage and was a source of the scorching irony that he sent out to America. This conflict between the putative political and religious ideals of this nation and its contrary practices. But for Douglass, this conflict was personal. For one, this conflict had visited itself upon the body and mind of Douglass and his bondsmen and women in the form of Bible-quoting, sadistic slavers. More importantly, though, the conflict directly challenged and undermined the only ideals that seemed to offer deliverance. The starkest and most referenced example of this conflict is in his narrative, in the scene where he longed to be one of the tall ships sailing on the Chesapeake Bay. He gave us what he called his soul's complaint, with an apostrophe to the moving multitude of ships. You've probably read this before or heard of it before, but I want to read it one more time. I'm not going to unpack it completely, but I'm going to say a few things about it afterwards. To quote him, "You are loosed from your mooring and are free. I am in my chains and am a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's swift-winged angels that fly round the world. I am confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free. Oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks and under your protecting wing. Alas, betwixt me and you the turbid waters roll. Go on, go on. Oh, that I could also go. Could I but swim, if I could fly. Oh, why was I born a man of whom to make a brute? The glad ship is gone, she hides in the dim distance. I am left in the hottest hell of unending slavery. Oh, God, save me, God, deliver me, let me be free. Is there any God? Why am I a slave?" Douglass presents in his soul's complaint a personal and political account of the problem of evil. He goes on to state that he will find the internal resources to free himself. However, this passage is remarkable, not only for its pathos and what it records, but also because it displays that in addition to the torture of enslavement, he felt mocked by the rhetoric of political and religious ideals that surrounded him and offered him hope. He writes in the passage that immediately follows the above, "Thus I used to think, and thus I used to speak to myself, goaded almost to madness at one moment, and at the next reconciling myself to my wretched lot." Douglass, as a young man, felt caught between madness and reconciling himself to his misery. The passage is a description of his rage and disenchantment over the moral failure that is his slavery and that surrounds him. After escaping from slavery and joining the abolition movement, Douglass worked for the charge of being an opponent of religion. In the narrative, he draws our attention to the contradictions between Christian ideals and practice and asserts the Christian slaveholders were the cruelest because they saw their faith as justificatory. A controversy surrounded him over his refusal to thank only the actions of men and to never thank God for the deliverance of black people. Then there are his speeches and editorials where he challenges the political efficacy of Christianity for black liberation. At various times and places, he condemns American Christianity and given this and proclaims that atheism would be better than a hypocritical Christianity. And given this hypocrisy, he proclaims that it is not surprising that black Americans have come to loathe the church. He goes so far as to publicly wonder what use Christianity is to black Americans in the climate of American hypocrisy. Douglass consistently tied together his disappointment with American political and religious ideals. In both, he saw a political and ethical void that haunted him. For example, in his 1894 pamphlet, The Lesson of the Hour, he wrote, "When the Negro looked for his body that belonged to his earthly master, when he looked for his soul, that had been appropriated by his heavenly master. And when he looked around him for something that really belonged to himself, he found nothing but his shadow, and that vanished into the air when he might most want it." A year before his death, although he stubbornly hangs on to his political and religious principles, right, he pauses and recognizes that these ideals have left black America with nothing but their vanishing shadows, caught again between madness and reconciliation to misery. This alienation is radical, because it is a recognition of an unethical anti-black world that is unrelenting. Further, this version of alienation is amazing in its depth, because as Bernard Boxall has claimed, Douglas's conception of interdependent American identity leaves no choice for the black American but to be an American. And if being American proves to be impossible, then the black American is left without even an identity. Or as Douglas stated, black Americans are left with shadows that vanish in the air. What of the night? In 1889, Douglas posed this rhetorical question as part of his Nation's Problem speech, in which he confronts America's failure to deliver social justice despite its political and religious ideals. His message was that there is no such thing as a Negro problem. Instead, Douglas claimed, the real question is whether America will ever live up to its promises and ideals. Douglas' solution to the nation's problem is standard. Live up to your religious and political ideals. Pursue cultural and political assimilation. And in the course of time, the population of America will amalgamate. He has a special message for African Americans. According to Douglas, they must work harder and be representative of the best values. They, African Americans, ought to live among whites, not cultivate race pride, and be enterprising and industrious as to appeal to the economic interest of white men. The question, what of the night, came from his reading of Hamlet and his perception of America's moral, political, and religious failure. It was a powerful question that arose from his critical vision, but he could do no better than appeal to enterprise, assimilation, and this obliterating dream of amalgamation. So then, what of the night? Well, I will spare you a long critique of Douglas's political positions, but as we all know, those shortcomings. But despite those shortcomings, Douglas's vision of the racial future of the United States, right, when we consider it, we should not want to lose sight of Douglas's ideals, nor his radical alienation. The consciousness of political and ethical failure, his mourning of that failure, and the resulting rage that expressed itself with scorching irony are constituents of his legacy as well. Contemporary attempts to reassert Douglas's project, whether it's denationalization, diasporic thought, anti-racialism, racial nominalism, reassert Douglas's project, right? And resurrect as well Douglas's radical alienation. It is part of the history of the debate. On one hand, to have the longing for justice, and on the other hand, to have this radical realization that justice will never be actualized. We ought to pay attention to how the history of this debate, and we too, are caught between what Douglas called madness on one hand and reconciliation to our misery on the other. Thank you.